So I just wanted to walk through how I make my sourdough. There's about 9,000 different ways to make it, but the kind of sourdough that I prefer is not the artisanal, like super hard crust with all the big, holes in it from the bubbles, because it's not as practical. So I like to make sandwich bread. And so the recipe I have, it's very forgiving. It's really pretty easy. It doesn't require nearly as much babysitting as some others. But it's just a lot more practical. So you'll want a big bowl, ripe sourdough starter. You want to feed it 4 to 8 hours ahead of time, just depending. And if you're not sure if it's ripe or not, do a drop test by taking a little spoonful of it and dropping it in water. If the majority of it floats, then it's ripe. I have all-purpose unbleached organic flour. I like to use very fine salt, and I use pink Himalayan salt, but you don't have to. You can use regular salt. Filtered or purified room temperature water. I also have a completely rubber spatula. It depends. You can use your hands too. A lot of people prefer to use their hands. I don't always like to get that dirty, and so I use a rubber spatula because it comes off the rubber better than it comes off of wood. And you will definitely want a scale. To start off with, we're going to mix the starter, the flour, and the water. Now the recipe I go off of, I actually add a little bit more to it because I like my loaves to be a little bit bigger. So I'll give you the recipe. You can use it, just buy the recipe, go off of those measurements if you want to, but I usually do 1 1/4 the measurements to make a little bit bigger loaves. I'm gonna do the starter, 568 grams of ripe sourdough starter. So now I'm going to add 859 grams of flour. And I like to do the flour before the water. Yeah, that was not enough. Because if it's easier to scoop out dry flour if I accidentally pour too much in. And I can just scoop a little bit off the top. And that is easy to do. Lastly, we're going to need 496 grams of water. And I find it easiest to make a little bit of a well in the flour. So you kind of like dig a little hole in the middle and then pour the water in there. And then as you're mixing it, you kind of grab flour from the sides as you mix in the water. And again, with the water, if you make the little well, like I did, and you overshoot it, like I did, you can kind of scoop it out of the well to remove that. Okay, now I got my water to the correct amount, and I'm going to start mixing in all the ingredients. I like to get my little spatula wet first, and then just sort of pull from the outside as you mix in all the ingredients. And do this until all of the ingredients are well incorporated. Now this is a bit of an arm workout. You will get good forearm for this, but again, I prefer to use a spatula because I just don't want to get all doughy. But if you'd rather, you can use your hands. It does work a little bit faster. And if you're making more loaves in one batch, sometimes a spatula is not enough. You have to use your hands. So just kind of depending on how much you do. Okay, once the dough is all well incorporated, there's no dry flour left. Make sure that you also are scraping the bottom, getting all the dry flour well incorporated into the dough. You're going to cover it with a tea towel and let it sit for 20 minutes. Okay, now that 20 minutes is up, we're going to add in the salt with my recipe. I'm going to add 17 grams of salt. What I like to do is dip my fingers in water and kind of poke holes in the dough so that the salt can kind of get down into the dough. I'll usually do 8 grams and then mix it up, and then 9 grams so that it's not all in one spot. Okay, there's 9 grams. And then mix that salt in really well. You don't want there to be like clumps of salt if you can avoid it. So try to really mash it in. And this is also where fingers might make it a little easier, but it will make it messier. So up to you how messy you want to get. And poke holes again. I'm gonna add the rest of my salt. Okay. Mix this really well until all of the salt is well incorporated and the dough should be really smooth and supple. Okay. Once you feel like it is thoroughly mixed, you're going to cover it again with the tea towel and you're going to let it sit for 1 hour. Now, one thing to keep in mind with any kind of dough really, but I've found this especially the case with sourdough, is that if you let it harden, it will become cement. So anything I'm using that gets the dough on it, you want to rinse it pretty quickly. Or like for instance, if you're letting it sit for a while in a bowl, there's going to be parts that just are going to get hard because they're around the sides. So soak it. Once you're done using the bowl, make sure it soaks for a little bit, and then don't ever use like a scrubby sponge or a brush on it because that dough will work its way down in there and you'll never get rid of it. So scrape all of it off with a scraper or something like that. Just a word of caution to you as you're using things, rinse them as quickly as possible. Now it has been an hour. We're going to stretch and fold the bread. There are a couple different ways that people do this. I always get my hand wet first so it doesn't stick as much. Some people tell you to fold like an envelope or like a letter in an envelope. I find it's easiest to kind of just move the bowl a quarter turn every time. So hand is wet, not soaking wet. And you're gonna kind of reach kind of under the dough and fold it into the middle. And then turn it a quarter turn, reach, stretch a bit and fold under. Reach, stretch a bit, and fold under. You don't want to tear the bread if you can avoid it, and re-wet your hand as necessary. But you do want to kind of be reaching halfway under so that you're really scooping the bread up, and you're not wanting to let the bubbles pop too much, and you're not wanting to tear the bread, so be gentle, but you do want to stretch it a bit and fold it. And I do this several times. It's kind of up to your discretion. It doesn't make that big of a difference, so if you can only do it a couple times, fine. If you get sort of lost in thought and do it a bunch, it's probably not going to hurt anything. So, and once you've stretched and folded it as many times as you'd like, you're going to cover it again and you're going to let it sit another hour. The thing about the sourdough bread, any sourdough bread, is that there's a lot of downtime, so you just have to plan your day out well around it. Next step is called the bulk fermentation. If you're just doing this all in a single day, this will take an hour. If you are wanting to start it in the evening and then finish it the next day, this is the point where I will, instead of putting a tea towel over it, I will wrap it in plastic wrap and stick it in the fridge overnight. Bring it out in the morning. You just have to let it get back up to kind of room temperature, so that usually takes about an hour and a half, 2 hours before you start the next step. Okay, an hour has passed for the bulk fermentation, and you're going to thoroughly coat the area with flour. Now, because I make bread for my fiance who cannot have gluten, I use gluten-free flour for this portion because this flour is not fermenting. So if you want to like stay as gluten-free as possible, use gluten-free flour for this portion. Otherwise, you can use just regular flour for the non-stickiness properties. But I am going to use gluten-free flour so that Aaron can eat the bread. And I'm just gonna kind of cover the whole area. Okay, now we're gonna take the bread out of the bowl, and I have this little silicone spatula that works really well for this. If you have any sort of wet dough left in there, go ahead and pull that out and add it to the top. There will be obviously plenty of dried dough. This will need to soak. Now you're going to divide this depending on how many loaves you're planning to make. Since I'm only making 2, you're going to divide this in half and try to make it as even as possible. So I'm going to sort of form it into a round. I'm notoriously not the best at making this super even, but it doesn't really matter, it's all going in the same place. So wherever you find the middle, just sort of separate it, and then you're going to form those 2 halves into rounds, and you're going to let them sit for another 20 minutes. And you do want your hands covered in flour as you're doing this, but you're kind of trying to touch the top of the bread as little as possible so that you're not getting too much dry flour on this portion of the bread, because then when you go to actually put it in the pans, what will happen is that any dry flour will not let the dough stick together, and so there will be like creases in your bread that are not stuck together. So take your tea towel again and cover the loaves, and you're gonna let that sit for 20 minutes. Okay, 20 minutes is up. So we're going to remove the tea towel. Now again, I like my bread for sandwiches, and so instead of baking this in a Dutch oven or something where they would be round, remain round, I bake them in bread pans because that is sandwich shaped. I take my bread pans, lightly spray them with oil, if you have oil spray. Otherwise you can get a paper towel wet with some oil and rub it around on the inside. It does not need to be soaking, it just needs to be lightly coated. And then cover your hands in flour so they don't stick. And you're going to grab your loaves, flip them kind of upside down as like logs sort of, and put them in the pan. So I'm kind of rolling it up, sort of. Yeah, this one's definitely bigger than the other one. I'm really bad at making them even. And then I kind of push it just very gently into the corners so that it will fill the corners. That is preference. You can also just leave it if you want. And then we're gonna let it sit again. So I'm gonna move this over so that my pan is not sitting in flour. So let this sit, again, covered for 2 hours or so. And then we'll come back again to cut them and put them in the oven. Okay, so our rising the pans is done. As you can see, they've kind of nicely filled out the pan. So now we're going to slash the bread. I'm using a bread lame. You can also just use a sharp knife, whatever you want. And this is just because as the bread expands, it's going to bulge, and this will allow for it to bulge in a way we want it to. I'm going to slash straight down the middle, decently deep slash, I don't know, probably 1/4 of an inch. I also will slash the very edges because then it will kind of expand upwards and it will make the heels less sloping. You're essentially going to make an I, like a capital I shape. So I'm going to slash right down the middle. And then down the sides. And try to make the cut as evenly deep across as you can. Okay. So they're not beautiful cuts, but you can kind of see it there. And now I don't add flour to the top. Again, it just kind of makes it more messy when it comes out. You can add flour to the top of it if you'd like, but I'm just gonna stick these in the oven. I stick them in at 350 for 40 minutes, and usually at halfway mark, I will just rotate them around because my oven isn't evenly hot, and so then the back, which tends to get a little more well done than the front, has a chance to not get burnt. So I'm gonna stick those in the oven and then pull them out when they're done. Okay, so now once you pull them out of the oven, you can test the bottom by sort of tapping on it. If it sounds hollow, makes a knocking sound, they're done. These ones are not, so they need just a few more minutes. Okay. So now they're making a somewhat hollow sound, meaning that they are done. So you are going to put them on a cooling rack. They might not be perfect, but they'll be delicious. And then you let them cool. Try not to cut into the bread while it's still hot, but sometimes it's irresistible. So at least let it cool down a little bit or you will burn yourself. But that is how you make sourdough bread. And because it has no preservatives, no anything like that in it, if you're not going to eat it within a week, you should freeze it. And don't put it in the refrigerator because then it will become soggy. Enjoy!